my slides. We will jump around a little bit between my slide deck for some kind of talking points, some anchoring within our presentation. We'll spend some time in Microsoft Word. We'll spend some time in Adobe Acrobat. Do know that most of these principles are transferable across over to the Google workspace. There are some differences in Google Docs in regards to how you do some of the accessibility features within tables that I can reference as we're talking about some of those processes, but today's presentation is going to squarely focus within that Microsoft document space, Microsoft Word space, and then that transference over to PDFs. Similarly, some of this transfers over to slide decks and Excel, but those two platforms within the Microsoft 365 suite are kind of unique instances in regards to how they translate over to PDFs if that is your final source format. So with all that being said, let's get started. So today's presentation, like I said, is all about accessible tables in Word to PDF. I am Josh Barton. Since the last time I presented to now, I have changed roles within the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. I am now leading this work for our agency fully, as well as helping support all of our school systems across the state in understanding the requirements of digital accessibility and everything that impacts across our infrastructures. So with that, I'm housed within our Digital Learning and School Connectivity Office, and my title, depending on who you talk to, is either Digital Accessibility Coordinator or Specialist, so we kind of use those two interchangeably. We will definitely share the presentation out afterwards, and then I've got some support documents that we can distribute as well after today's session. And Amy, if you'll help me, Amy or Phoebe, if you guys will help me just monitor the chat some, I've got it set up so I should be able to see pings come through, but if you guys can help me monitor that some too, if people have questions, that'd be awesome. All right, so let's get started. All right, so for our goal today is going to be pretty straightforward. The first piece that I want to encourage folks to think about anytime we're talking about tables is the fact that should a table have been used in the first place? So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that variable first. Oftentimes we see tables used for a variety of different reasons across document landscapes. And so it's an important piece and an important place to have some conversations with our folks that are doing that document content creation. From there, we'll spend some time looking at how to apply the correct accessibility settings to simple tables in Word. We'll advance from there and looking at tables that are potentially more complex but could be simplified based on some of the structuring and formatting styles that folks sometimes use, things that I've experienced and seen. We'll spend a little bit of time after that talking about remediating some more complex table structures. And by no means are we going to go into the full complexity of what tables might look like across our digital landscape for the state. But do know that as we kind of work through this session today and as we spend time looking across all the different platforms, that I'm happy to address questions, answer things as we can. And then finally, it's just a good important reminder that if any of the product tools, resources that I referenced today by no means are an endorsement from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, NCDIT, the Office of Digital Learning and School Connectivity, any of those folks. They're mainly there to highlight options that are out there and available and to walk through systems to support the scope of this work. Additionally, any checklists or accessibility tools that I reference, it's important to recognize and understand that those are as good as they can be in the present moment today. This landscape is constantly changing as tools evolve and shift. As a matter of fact, when I was preparing today's presentation, there's been some changes in the way Microsoft exports some of the elements that actually makes some of this table work a little bit easier. But this is kind of an ever-evolving landscape and a space that we kind of have to stay up to date in, continue to explore, continue to evolve in and around. Additionally, there are some other tools out there that can make table remediation easier. But for today's purposes, we're going to focus squarely just in that Acrobat Pro and Word space. So as a reminder for why this really matters right now, why there's such an emphasis on the digital accessibility piece. And a lot of that has to do with the DOJ ruling and that compliance window that was extended to April 2026 or April of 2027, depending on, or was previously April of 26, is now extended to April of 27 or 28, depending on the size of your instance that you're supporting. There's always that underlying non-discrimination obligation, though, that has always been active, right? What changed within Title II is not a requirement for stuff to be digitally accessible. That's always been there. What has changed is what that minimum level of success with the accessibility really looks like as we're having these conversations. And that's where they've established that minimum standard of WCAG 2.1 AA. So it's really important to recognize that. And data tables and tables as a whole are one of those things that frequently fail accessibility elements, especially with historically how they exported out of authoring platforms over to a PDF source file. It historically required a heavy level of manual remediation in that Acrobat Pro software to refine and clean up and ensure that everybody was engaging with the content in the way that it was intended to be engaged with. So some foundations, just as reminders, we're not going to dig into these topics today, but anytime we're looking at documents, thinking about those text elements, the structure elements within documents, so heading structures, using the built-in list features, table formatting and table structures, which we will spend time on, reviewing and making sure that that logical reading order is in play, especially when we transfer this content over to our PDF space, wanting to make sure that the reading order is maintained across those spaces, thinking about that alt text for any images that are embedded. And sometimes we see that when we have tables and then charts going along with those tables. And then always remembering that we want to make sure that we're not conveying information by color alone, but in multiple means instead. Some other things to be thinking about as we're digging into this work is just the structuring and formatting of tables and the use of other text elements within that space as a whole. So the first part, as I indicated, is going to be spending a little bit of time talking about when to use tables and making some decisions in that space. When I look at documents across the landscape of the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, this is a common conversation I find myself in with the various offices across our agency is the table the right structure to be using for this resource, right? We see tables used for layout purposes, for spacing, for all kinds of different reasons other than what tables are really intended to be used for, right? Tables are intended to be used in a way that groups and organizes information and connects it to relevant topics, relative headings that organize that content in a specific and meaningful way. And so this decision framework here looks to process up some questions that we can ask and some conversation points to have as we're engaged in this work to make some decisions about whether or not a table should have been used in the first place. And so within this framework, we just have 4 simple kind of steps along the way. So is a table the right structure? So thinking about other formatting styles we could have chosen, whether that be lists or columns or things like that. If it is right, has it been structured correctly? If it looks complex, could it be simplified in any way? And then if it cannot be simplified, let's dig in and remediate it as it sits. And so we're going to kind of work through each of these different elements throughout the rest of today's session. So let's talk a little bit here at the start about whether or not that table is the right choice, right? And so here's some things to think about when we're looking at, should the content be a table? Does it fit relational or multidimensional data, right? So tables are designed to group that information in a meaningful way. Do the values and meaning depend on either the row or the column that it's in, or what is the rationale behind how the information has been organized within that table? If it's a single column of items or a plain sequence, should that really be in a table, or should we be looking at lists, whether that be a dot point list or a numbered list, or the use of headings alone with paragraph text? And then making sure that we recognize that tables really should not be used for visual or page layout purposes, right? There are other ways that we can look at and explore organizing content within a page using styles features instead of using a table to serve that purpose. So let's look at a table real quick that I've prepared ahead of time in Microsoft Word. And think about what we just discussed there, right? So here we have some information about upcoming training dates, and it is simply a list of those elements, right? We have some text applied ahead of it, kind of organizing the structure of this page, and then we just have that single set of one column with rows delineating each of those elements. So based on what I just shared, and I'll go back to that slide here in just a minute as well, what do you all think? Should we look at using a table here, or should we go with something else? Yeah, so I see a no immediately in the chat. Yeah, right. So like when I see stuff like this, immediately I'm like, there are, in my brain, much better ways to organize content and information of this nature, right? I see somebody put make it a list. A couple of people are putting make it a list, right? I love the use of lists. Those of you that have explored navigating resources with a screen reader know that different text element styles get voiced differently by that screen reader. So, and allow for different navigation options. So when we have headings in a document, a screen reader user can navigate just by those. If we have a table, they can navigate and find all the tables, lists similarly, and it gets shared in different ways. So with something like this, a list might be a great option, right? Depending on the rest of the document surrounding this, I would likely have some heading structures leading up to that list, and then we would simply have the list of dates. And the great thing about that is it reads it as that. So it would say a list containing 4 items because there are 4 dates for the trainings that are coming up. And then the person using that alternate access would get those list items in that order. If this was a sequentially occurring thing, we would want to consider a dot point list versus a numbered list. But yeah, based on what I kind of outlined in some of those questions, this would be a great thing to think about in other structures, other format styles within the document itself. All right, so we won't play around with moving that over to an accessible format or even looking at that in the PDF, but we're going to continue on in the presentation, right? So should we table it or not? 2 examples. So I just showed that upcoming training dates list, and then we have another option here of regional office directory. And within that option, and we'll look at that in table format, it contains 4 separate areas of information. We have a region space, we have a contact name space, we have an email address, and we have a phone number. So in that instance, when I'm looking at my consideration process and thinking through, should it be a list? Should it be a table? What should the formatting be? We can start to answer some of these questions, right? There is an organizational structure to those elements, and we can start to think about it in other ways, right? That directory is a matrix, right? Absolutely. And so let's look at that in a table format, and then we're going to start actually spending some time talking about tables and the settings we want to look at. So here we have 3 different examples of tables that we routinely see. All of these are really simple tables in that there's not a lot of complexity in regards to having potentially multiple rows or columns that could be functioning as table headers in any capacity, but instead they're just simple examples, right? So in this first one here, we have a simple table that only has column headers. So that first row is in that everything under it within a given column represents and connects back to that first row of information. In the second table sample, we have just row headers. So that first column is functioning to represent the data to the right of it in each row across the table. And then in our final example here within this resource, we have a table that represents row and columns. And so there's some different formatting settings that we would want to apply to these tables in Word to make sure that when we export to that PDF, it transfers everything out accordingly and it is pre-structured the way we want it to be structured. Before we look at that in Word, though, I want to show you what happens if we were to export it out without any of those settings applied within that accessibility principle. So those of you that have seen me present before know that historically I've talked about using Acrobat in the ribbon. And so within Microsoft Word, if you have Acrobat Pro, a ribbon tool is installed within your instance of the Microsoft 365, and it gives you an option to create PDFs from there. However, in recent that have occurred both across Adobe and the Microsoft 365 platform, it's actually more stable to go about this in a different manner. And so instead of using the Acrobat ribbon, we're actually going to go to the File menu, and then we're going to go to Export down here towards the bottom of our options, and we're going to choose to create an Adobe PDF. So once that pops up, it's going to give me some options for what I want to do. I'm going to add an element here so I know which one it is. So I'm just adding no structure to that save box. We'll hit save, and it begins the export process. By doing that and exporting it in that file format, that methodology, it's going to help make sure that it transfers over. Why would someone want to make regions row, headings, and table C since table A? It's just a different option to represent it. You know, that may not be something somebody would really want to do, and that could be a place where we would have that conversation. This is purely built out just for demonstration purposes today, and would be a space to have some more robust conversations with folks for sure. All right, so let's open up what this looks like right now in Adobe Acrobat. And I am going to adjust my screen resolution a little bit to make this easier to see. All right, so here we have our tables. And one of the first things we want to do when we get into this Adobe Acrobat space, if you haven't already done this, is we want to make sure that we have access to all of the tools that we need access to for looking at the accessibility of this resource. And so within Adobe Acrobat Pro, if you're in the new version, those tools end up living in this right-hand control panel. And to make sure that you have everything you need over there, you would right-click on that panel, and there are 3 tools that we want to make sure we have available to us within that panel. We want to make sure we have our content tool available. That deals with some of the layering of elements and one aspect of reading order adjustments. We want to make sure we have our order tool, which also allows for easy access to the reading order tool, which allows us to tag content if it hasn't been tagged already. And then we want to have our accessibility tags. That's the last tool that we want to make sure we have available within that space. By default, those are not already turned on, so those are things you would want to turn on as I have done. Once we have that up, we're going to start here in the accessibility tags. And we're doing that for today's purposes because I want to highlight something that happens for a couple of reasons. One, oftentimes when we get documents in or we already have PDF documents available that we're trying to remediate, this could be a process you would have to go through for fixing it. Because of a change that Microsoft Word has put in that export process, once I show you how to properly structure them in Word, there's some steps we no longer have to do because they're already done by default, and we just verify that. So over here in my accessibility tags, I'm going to navigate and find one of my tables. And once I select that accessibility tag, it now highlights this table for me within the document. A nice change that happened recently in Acrobat Pro is I can now right-click on this element and say that I want to open Table Editor. If you're in a previous version or an old version of Adobe Acrobat Pro, you used to have to go to the order tool to get to the table editor, but now it's natively accessible through accessibility tags, which makes this a lot easier and simpler. So once I select that, it now highlights my table in a different manner, right? It's now highlighting all of the cells, and you'll see that I have some things going on within this. Within these cells, it has now added TD text across every single cell element within my table. And that has happened because I've turned that feature on. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So if we right click on the table, once we're in table editor, we can go into table editor options. And there are a couple of options within this table editor that I like to turn on to simplify my life a little bit as I'm working in tables. So this top section here are some color options. And in that space, you can adjust the colors for your purposes. These are the default colors that it has set up, but it allows you to adjust colors for your border. So the border around each cell, it allows you to adjust the color for your header cells. So how it identifies that you actually have that header, differentiates that from a data cell, and then a selection color. So what cell you're actually working on at the given time. And then by default, the only checkbox that is selected within this editing options menu is show cells with a missing header. And it does that with kind of a pink color right now. I like to turn on two additional options that are available in this space. The first is show cells that span multiple rows or columns. That'll be helpful when we get to more complex tables. And then the last thing I like to turn on is this label option, which shows the cell type, table header or a table data cell. And that's really important to be able to quickly identify because that helps us ensure that the table is correlating the correct information for alternate access users. So since I have those two features on, we can see that right now, because of the way I exported this without doing the proper steps in Word, everything in this first table is just a table data cell. And that's a problem for us, right? It's a problem for us because alternate access users aren't going to have that relational information saying that in this first column, region 1 applies to a region within our state, for instance. And that everything in column 2 is the contact name as it relates to that information. And April, this is a great space to have that more robust conversation around why we may want to have this first column as a row header in addition to that column headers assigned, because it gives us an opportunity to get some correlational information. So as we're tracking across this, it would help those alternate access users recognize that Avery Brooks is connected to region 1 because of the correlational information we've applied through those table heading structures. So if you have a table that's structured like this, we have to do some manual steps to adjust the table settings and edit this now that we're in Table Editor. So the first thing we would need to do is actually make this first row, assign all of those cells as our table headers. And so since I'm in Table Editor, I can select the first element, press and hold Shift on my keyboard to select the rest of the elements in that row. I then right-click and do Table Cell Properties. This now brings up another dialog box where I can make some decisions about what needs to happen with these table cells. Since all of those are the same type of cell, and I know that they all need to be a header cell, I can go ahead and select that here. And then I need to do a secondary step while I'm in this space, which is actually assigning the scope. So the scope tells the screen reader technology which cells are connected to that header cell. And so in this instance, since it's just column headers, I would select from the dropdown of the scope elements, column header, and select OK. And you'll now see that it has assigned that first row as table headers. And as such, all of the information below it is now connected to that header column. Similarly, if we expand our table element over in the document accessibility tabs, we can see that this table element has now been assigned to those individual cells. So they are now showing table headers as well in our accessibility tags, which is really great. If we look at the table below that, without having applied those, that first row is not going to have the information that we need it to have. It's just going to show those as table data elements. So that is a manual process for remediating a table and the steps we need to take to make that remediation happen for a simple table. I'm going to close out of this example, and I'm going to go back to our Word example because I want to show you the steps now to make those tables accessible before we do that export process. And we're going to go back to the slide deck real quick too to highlight this ahead of time. All right, so when we think about what makes a table simple and what it needs, it's either a single header row or a single header column. It has no merged or split cells. And then the things that we need to make sure that it has in place in Microsoft Word before we move it out are that it has a true header designation, that header repeats across pages if it breaks. And we want to do that because we want to make sure when we're thinking about accessibility, we're thinking about all of the different areas that we want to support with accessibility. And also, if you're dealing with really long and complex tables, that helps everybody track and manage where they're at within the table as it relates to those headers. A good practice is to have a brief table description ahead of it. It is not a requirement within the WCAG, but it's a good practice to make sure. And then always we want to make sure we have that logical reading order. So now that we've talked about that, we're going to actually go through that process of doing that, setting that up within our tables in Microsoft Word. So we're going to look at that first sample table and look at the steps we need to take. So with each of these, there's going to be some different settings we're going to apply. So if we click into the table itself, we now within Microsoft Word have some additional options available to us for table editing specifically. So once I'm in a cell within the table I want to work on, I want to click into table design. And here within table design, we have some additional options to help improve the accessibility of this table. The first thing we want to look at doing is we want to look at identifying the header information in this table. And since it's a simple table that just has that header row, so that then gives us our column headers, we would select from our options within the table design menu, header row, and make sure that that checkbox is selected. What this does is it does some background coding so that now when we export this over to Acrobat, which we'll look at in a minute, it will have already tagged that appropriately. And in the recent update, it also now automatically assigns that scope to that table for us as well. Some other considerations to make for improving the accessibility of this table would also be to think about doing some banded rows, right? And so we could look at applying to the rest of this information some banding, which is just going to give it some different fill colors across each of those rows. So it is often helpful to have your header row be one color, and then every alternating row from there have some light shading applied to it to help improve the overall accessibility of that resource. Within the Department of Public Instruction, we have a color guide that I would be using to help simplify my color choice for how I might consider doing this banding. And we also have recently applied some standards for what table design looks like, or we're in the process of applying that, so that we have consistent banding of this nature kind of built into our structures. So we do that again to help just differentiate for visual tracking and other purposes along those lines. When we look at this second table, we would want to think about giving it an identification for this first column to be header rows. And there's a way to do that as well in Microsoft Word. So while we're in the second table where it only has that row headers, we're again going to be in that table design tool, and we're going to choose first column. And so that will now export it out to that final PDF and indicate that that first column is functioning as row headers within that table, and will automatically apply that. And then for the last one where we have both occurring, where we have column headers and row headers occurring, we're going to go in and we're going to select both options. So header row and column, first column, and that again is going to indicate across all of these tables the correct accessibility practices. So I'm going to go back to File, Export, create Adobe PDF. Oh, yep. It would help if I saved it first. All right, so now it'll let me export because I have saved that file. Yeah, so you want to do export as PDF over save as PDF just because I found it to be the most stable way to ensure your tags transfer over. You definitely never want to print to PDF, but in my experience, this export to PDF seems to transfer everything the most consistently across the various instances that I've used. There are times, Greg, where I will do it using the other options available just because of the way it exports, and some different options there. All right, so let's do this export. Yeah, so that export does automatically apply the tags, as we'll see here in a minute. All right, so we are exporting this one, and we'll see some differences when I go into that PDF file now from the previous one.
Chart looks different unless it always looks like that.
So oddly enough, there's some funkiness happening with the way it's exporting that. It's not showing all of the cell lines, which is weird, and some of the funkiness that sometimes happens in Adobe. But let's go ahead and zoom in because we can still see kind of the structure of some of the things that I want to highlight. All right, that looks better now that I'm zoomed in. All right, so now if we go to our accessibility tags and we look at our first table, and we go into that table editor by right-clicking and navigating the table editor, we will see a difference has occurred here. At this point now, that first row, because I did the work in Microsoft Word ahead of time, is now properly tagged as a table header. Historically, in some of the older versions of Adobe Acrobat, there would still be a manual process we would have to do to assign that scope. But in some of the recent updates that have happened, if I now check one of these by right-clicking on the cell and going into table cell properties, we can see that the scope is already applied. So that is a really great positive change that's happened for us from some of the previous instances, because this used to be a really heavy manual process. It is still something that I personally like to double check, just because of my previous lived experience working in PDFs. So I always try to verify it here, but then also through some accessibility checks. Similarly, if I navigate to our next table in this document and go to that table editor, that first column has now properly been identified as table headers again. And if we check the scope, it has applied that row setting. And then if we navigate to our final one and we go into table editor, we will see that we have both options. So the tables have all of the headers cells have been identified. If we click and check on the cells, we will see that they've been correctly identified. So this region will apply to everything below it, and then region 1 would apply to everything to the right of it, since we have done the row and column tagging ahead of time in Microsoft Word. So that is a really positive change that's happened from the previous instances of Microsoft Word into more recent instances. It is now automatically giving us all of that table information for our headers and then applying that scope for us as well, which is, like I said, it's a huge time-saving effort and improves the success of this work significantly. All right, so we've talked about tables that are simple, and let's now move into something that's potentially a little bit more complex. So when we're thinking about looking at some more complex tables that we sometimes encounter, here are some good things to think about, right? So does it have multi-level headers, and does it really need to have those? Does it need to have those merged or split cells, section divider rows, things of that nature? And some simple questions to ask when we see tables of that nature is, could it be split into a couple of different tables, right? It doesn't have to be one continuous table to have it in a document. We can split complex tables into separate tables. Are those merge cells there for decorative purposes instead of structural? Could they be pulled out and applied as a header before you get into the table? Things of that nature. And then would repeating a header label work as well as merging it? So thinking about some ways to build any of that out and whether or not we can simplify it. So we're now going to move in and look at a table that can be simplified. So this again is a table that I've pre-built out that has some complexities to it, but I've got both examples in the same document for us to show. And we want to look at some of those things that we just talked about. So identifying that merge cell is functioning as a header, like a stand-in header, and how we might want to look at considering restructuring that resource. All right. So here we have that side-by-side comparison. So this is not atypical of something I have seen come my direction for remediation work. So we've got a rather complex looking table. Let me zoom in a little bit more so we just see that one. Where we've got, it's a program budget summary. It's got kind of this budget line item, budgeted amount, actual amount required, variance between the two, and then it's split into two different sections, right? Where we have a personnel area where we're talking about each of those elements, and then we have operations section. And within that space, we could definitely go through the process of remediating this and making it fully accessible. But there are some other considerations we could make within this table, right? We could pull it out and separate the personnel one from the operations one. We could look at lots of different ways to restructure this and have some more robust conversations around how we might want this to function and serve to still address the same information, but in a simplified manner that makes that post-production remediation easier. So as we scroll down further and we look at the secondary option, here we've kind of changed the structure of it altogether, right? So we've taken those different banded elements and those kind of sub-heading structures and put them into the first column instead of these spans that are merged cells across multiple areas. When we look at these two and the structures, in my brain, they both really convey the same information, just in a simplified format, right? We also could have broken these out into two separate tables. It really is dependent upon the use case and the person who's built this out in regards to what direction you may want to take for that simplification process. But here we want to look at some of the things that happen and some of the challenges when we export this as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start to look at applying some of our settings. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this right-hand one where we've simplified it, go back to my table design, and I'm going to go ahead and assign that header and column. I have made that decision because of the way we've regrouped the information. And I know, because I rebuilt it, that personnel information and that operations information needs to transfer across that whole section of content. And over here also, I'm going to try to do some of that. And this is where it becomes a little more complex. So I'm going to go ahead and identify both of those as well, because it kind of follows that same principles. We need salaries to relate and connect up to everything to the right. And we need all of that column information and transfer down. So we're going to go ahead and save this again. And then we'll do our export process. All right, and here we are back in the PDF. So now when I open up my accessibility tags and I look at the table here and I go into my table editor, we're going to see some funkiness happening, right? So we now have, table headers have been assigned everywhere that we need to, but the scope probably isn't applying the way we need it to apply. So if I look at this personnel element, and I click on the table cell properties, it's assigned that to a row. And that's not going to give us the relationship information we need, right? Because really what that row needs to apply to are these salaries and benefits, and then that budgeted amount, that actual amount, and that variance amount. We can do all of that work here, but it is there are a lot more steps involved, and we have to do a lot more work in tagging and IDing every cell element and then doing some scope of assignments from there. If I go to our second table where we've simplified it and we go in and look at the table editor, here it's a lot simpler process again, right? So we now have this new category column that's going to tell us that everything in this first column is a category, and then we have that row information that moves across from there. So that's one of the reasons why we want to think about simplifying tables before just remediating. Like I said, we could spend time and I could show you guys all of the steps to make this first example accessible. It's totally doable. It is just exponentially more work than we want to do for something that could be simplified in a different format. All right, let's get back. Let me change my screen. Get back to our presentation. And the last piece that we're going to spend time looking at today are going to be some slides that we don't have a choice in the matter. We have to actually look at doing that remediation because there's not really a great way to simplify it. And in this instance, you'll see that we probably could have simplified it as well, but I wanted to walk through the process. So, it does have, as we look at this budget comparison, it's going to have row headers, it's going to have column headers, kind of fails those questions we just talked about. There are genuine two-way relationships between a cell's meaning, And it depends on both the row and the column header at once. And we need to be thoughtful in thinking through how we want to do that full process. So we're going to actually look at that now for a complex table and go through the process of what we would do to make this complex table accessible. So here we have a more complex table. Our first left-hand corner cell has some information that talks about the budget line item. And then we have columns that say quarter, and then the budgeted and actual kind of broken out in each of those columns. So just kind of a different way of grouping some of the information we had just looked at. When I look to make this fully accessible, I do think it's super helpful to have a table description prior to going into the table because it helps orient our users, everybody, into what this table is representing, what it is sharing, and why it is sharing that information. So it can be as thorough or as short as it needs to be. Some other things I want to highlight here that I haven't highlighted up to this point is that we also want to make sure, whenever possible, that especially this first cell, that upper left-hand corner, that very first cell somebody would have access to, always has information in it. That's one cell you want to make sure is never empty. Beyond that, you will find all kinds of varying feedback regarding merge cells like we have with the quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, as well as having empty data cells within the data itself. It is allowable to have an empty data cell. So let's say in this benefits section or contracted services section for quarter two, let's say we didn't have a budgeted amount or we didn't have an actual amount. It would be okay to have that as an empty cell. But really, in my opinion, it's better to have some data information in there, whether that be it to say not applicable or a zero sum in this instance. Having nothing in there can present some confusion along the way because it could be, it's hard to know whether or not it was just missed in preparing the table or if it was left empty intentionally. You will see some other opinions as well in regards to use of symbols in this space. And it's important to recognize that symbols get voiced differently for different screen readers. So like the asterisk and how it gets voiced can be different. So sometimes that can present challenges as well. And it also can present a cognitive load challenge in that we would have needed to share prior to getting into the table that this symbol represents this when you encounter it in that table. So I like to go simple is better and just put zeros or other pieces in there. Is the table description separate from words built in table caption property? The caption usually includes a table ID. It is a little bit different just in that it would precede the table instead of coming afterwards. Usually those captions, in my experience, almost always follow the table. So usually this table description would be a little more thorough than what's provided in this example compared to the table itself so that they have that orientation before they get there. Within this table description would also be a space to outline some of those other pieces. When I was in the Office of Exceptional Children, we have cell sizes or groups of students that are too small to report because you could potentially identify a student based on their school because of how few students they have that meet that demographic information. So that's the kind of things that we would usually provide in that table description is some of that orientation of how to use the table as opposed to kind of what this table description outlines. All right, so here I want to make sure again within my table design that I've identified that header and column information. We'll go ahead and do that for both of these tables. We're going to go ahead and save again. Now that we've applied that style. And then we'll do that export process. And then we'll look at the next steps we need to do to remediate this. And immediately, one of the things that you guys are going to notice when we pull this over is that we're going to have some challenges because we have this additional row of information that we need to make into headers that there was not a way we could do that natively in Word. And then similarly, we have this first cell that's spanning a couple of different rows, and then we have this first row that once we get to the quarters is spanning a couple of different columns. So there are a couple of additional steps we're going to need to take when we get over to that PDF. All right, so let's get to that PDF. Go. And we're going to look at the second one just because that's the one I want to look at. And we're going to go into that table editor. And because I turned on that feature where I've set it up so that it starts to tag the elements accordingly, you'll see that, again, as we've done for everything else, we've got some table headers that have been tagged properly and some other challenges as it relates to that. If I was to go ahead and run the accessibility tool, there's potential for some issues to get flagged here because of the spans that are covered and because we have these merged cells. So that's going to require some additional remediation work. I did not mean to do that. And so I'm going to go ahead and click into this first one because I need to verify what the span of that is. So when I'm looking at that first one, I know that it spans more than one row because it correlates to both the quarter one as well as, or actually it correlates below, but it could potentially correlate to additional information here. So we need to be thinking about that. So let's go to quarter one because that's an easier space to identify this. And we need to make sure that quarter one is covering more than one column. And so down here in the attributes section, I can change the column span to 2 and select OK. It will always give us this prompt at this point that says, are you really sure you want to be doing this? And it's asking for that verification because you can start to really mess up your table from here if you don't know what you're doing. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit yes because I know for sure that I need this quarter one information to cover all of the information below it in both of those. Similarly, I'm going to notice here that there's some funkiness in this cell because it's tagged budgeted as a row header, and I need to change that structure. And sometimes this can be a problem for us in general. And I'm actually going to take that and make it a data cell and pull it out and try to do some work from there to adjust it later on. So we would need to go through that process for every one of our elements here that we need to make sure we have aligned properly. So for each of these first headers that span, I'm going to have to go in and manually adjust that column span. And that's going to prompt me every time. And we have to do this because it would get flagged across all of our accessibility checkers to say that there's an error in regards to how it's correlating to the data below it. We don't need to worry about this first one here because really it only applies to that one column, even though it spans more than one row. I will go ahead and open that up because I'm hoping that by saying it spans more than one, that by changing that row span, it will help me with the rest of my table. So while I didn't really need this first cell to correlate to everything to its right, I needed to apply it to show that it's covering 2 rows to single out that budgeted cell. Now that I've done some of that initial work for those cells, I now need to come in here and change my second row where I have my budgeted and actual 2 table headers. So I'm selecting all of those by pressing and holding Shift while I click them, going into table settings, header cell, scope is column, and I don't need to make any other changes. So at this point, what I've indicated within this table now is that we have our table headers, we've got our merges showing that these quarters apply to 2 different columns because I adjusted the span, and that's all the changes I need to make within this table for it to now be fully accessible. If we think back to that previous example I was showing just a few moments ago with that complex table that could be simplified, right? We could have done some of those same practices here in that final PDF with kind of adjusting how this personnel is applied, changing the span and all of those pieces. But again, in this instance, to me, it makes better sense to simplify. All right. So now that I've shown you quickly how to do some of the simple, some of the complex, and some of those other pieces, it's important to understand and recognize the final steps that we would need to take. So the last steps, the last verification pieces that we always want to make sure we do is we want to run our accessibility checkers. Those of you that have heard me talk about PDF accessibility before know that I've referenced before that historically the Adobe Acrobat accessibility checker doesn't necessarily directly correlate to the WCAG standards fully. I like to use the built-in accessibility checker. It will flag some of these table errors, table irregularities, but I always do a secondary check with the PDF accessibility checker because it does check against PDF UA and PDF and WCAG. I also really encourage folks to do some manual reviewing. So actually navigate the table with only your keyboard, with a screen reader running, to actually see and hear what that user experience is like for somebody else. And keep in mind that those automated checkers really are only as good as kind of whoever built them out, and they don't have that ability to verify that the mapping you have done is correct. So when we started to expand that scope and how many columns were being covered in the quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, an automated checker can say, yes, it meets the success criteria here, but it can't correlate and make sure that it actually is tracking back to the correct information within that header cell. So we want to think about that, and that's why we want to do some of that manual checking. This last section here is just to highlight some of those common errors to avoid. So skipping that step of should this even be a table? Anybody in DPI would tell you that every time we talk about tables, the first thing I ask is like, is there any other way we could have represented this information? The goal there is not to avoid tables altogether, but to make sure that we're using tables in the way that they're intended to be used and not for structural purposes. So that second one comes right off of that. So treating those merged cells as a formatting choice rather than a structural one. So sometimes we will find, as we've seen across today's demonstration, that there can be a time and place for merged cells. But it's important to think about, is that the route we want to take, or are there ways we could simplify first? Just again, because of how it changes that post-production remediation piece. Thinking about moving to complex remediation without checking for simplification first. Hopefully what you've seen kind of through the progression here is that we want to do as few of those last tables as we possibly can, because there are a lot of extra steps, particularly in how it's changed in the export process for that remediation piece. I did not specifically highlight Word's accessibility checker ahead of time or Acrobat Pro, but generally in my workflow, if I've got the source file like we had today, I always do the built-in checker in that source platform before we do that export. I had already done some of that, and in an effort to save some time, I skipped that step today. And then really trying to force that genuinely complex into a simple structure and resulting in losing meaning. So some things to think about there. I wanted to reiterate that decision framework that I highlighted at the beginning. So thinking through, is this table structure correct? How to do it differently, and some things of that nature. I see a question there in the chat. Are there similar tools for table creation in Google Docs as you've shown here in Word? So in Google Docs, it's a little bit different process. You don't have the ability there currently, as we talk today, there's not a native way in Google Docs to identify that first column as your row headers, as we were able to do in some of the tables. The only option you have in Google Docs is to identify that first row as column headers. And you want to do that by pinning it in Google Docs. So you would hover over the table in a Google Doc, and you get an option to your left of your table then that gives you a pin. That pin will duplicate that table header across 2 pages, but it also indicates then that it is a table header natively. So that is a shortcoming of Google Docs. And then there's no native accessibility checker in Google Docs. Right now, the only real option out there for checking accessibility of Google Docs is a product by Grackle. And Grackle has 3 different instances that are extensions that install in Google Docs, Slides, and Sheets. So that would be kind of the process for Google. And Tom, if you want to email me too, I can share with you some of those resources we have built out in DPI for that, some of that Google Docs accessibility work. And then the last thing I have here is just, I always like to try to highlight the accessibility commitment that was used throughout this presentation and throughout today's webinar. That gives us 6 minutes until the end of today's meetings. I'm going to pause here and open it up to any questions. Would you only alternate row shading when the table only has column headers? Also, would shaded headings be preferred over formatting the header text as bold, large than the rest of the table data? So a couple of different important pieces there. So that banded row setting. I like to try to use that across almost all of my tables. Usually my header rows, I differentiate by a different color. That is not a required element, but I do feel like it improves the overall accessibility for different users across the space. Um, as far as bold or larger, those are design decisions you can make in regards to the formatting. The biggest key is we want to make sure that we've checked those boxes to truly indicate that those cells are our header cells, because bolding text or making it bigger doesn't get voiced in any capacity. And so it just be represented in the same manner as all of the rest of the information within the table. So it wouldn't correlate it back or connect it up in any capacity. So we would want to make sure we do those other pieces. Hopefully that answers your question, Christina. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Amy, I don't know if you want to go ahead and stop the recording. That way, if people are more interested in asking questions and it not be captured,